turn to Donald Trump's America First isolationism, specifically his reiterated vow this week to renege on America's NATO commitments. Withdraw from the world, let the rest of the world take care of itself. We will have no entangling alliances. All these things that cannot be done are not to maintain the existence of human civilization. Because the United States, as the benevolent global hegemon for the past 3/4 of a century, is the one and only reason that humanity still exists today. Note I didn't say America still exists today, that that's the reason why we're still around. I mean, that's the reason why Earth, the inhabitants of this planet, have not incinerated themselves, exterminated themselves. That's why there hasn't been a general nuclear war because of the United States. Because the United States has stood in the way of bad guys, to colloquialize it, like Nazi Germany, like Benito Mussolini, like Imperial Japan, who could have risen to global power. I mean, we stopped the Soviet Union. Without the United States, the Soviet Union would have conquered the planet very quickly, in very short order, because the rest of the planet was destroyed, except for the United States. They would have taken Europe easily. And they would have taken Japan. They would have rolled up. I mean, they would have dominated the planet. But the United States stood in the way. Simple, straightforward, not difficult to understand in the slightest. Now here comes, isolationism led to World War II 80 years ago. What on earth does anybody think would happen with a repeat of that disastrous policy? World War II with nuclear weapons from day one. That's what would happen. And yet here's Donald Trump. Renege on our NATO commitments. I mean, Trump is already making the world even more dangerous than has Barack Obama. And if you had asked me even 6 months ago, well, okay, a year ago, if that were even possible, I would have said, more dangerous than Barack Obama has made the world? That's impossible. It can't be done. Trump's managing to do it. Kevin Williamson observed yesterday, National Review online. See, the White House put out a statement on Thursday assuring our European allies the United States' commitment to NATO is ironclad. Yeah, sure it is. I mean, that's a joke. That's a punchline, even without bringing Donald Trump into the equation. Now, Donald Trump is indeed a new kind of presidential candidate, one who is making the world worse and more dangerous long before ever being elected, if he ever could be, before his nominating convention even concluded. Trump, whose nickel and dime gestalt could only have come from a repeatedly failed casino operator, is a creature in search of petty advantages and small paydays. As such, he suggested on Thursday that the United States might forsake its commitment to NATO, our most important military alliance, because he believes that our NATO allies are not carrying their share of the expense. Trump's mind processes information the way a horse processes oats, and the end product is exactly the same. Now, call me reckless, but I'd be willing to wager an amount equivalent to Jonah Goldberg's annual pants allowance that Trump has no idea how NATO is actually funded, which turns out to be the sort of complex question that leaves him baffled and sputtering. Here's the short version. Common costs are funded by a long-standing proportional financing agreement based on gross national income. In other words, the reason why we pay the biggest share of the freight for NATO is because we're the biggest country in NATO. We were the benevolent global hegemon. So, 2 + 2 = 4, right? I know, Trumpligan's math's hard. while countries directly bear some other costs as when military assets are volunteered for NATO use, and we have more military assets than any other NATO member. So again, 2 plus 2, NATO has provided an excellent return on our investment. Now, it is true that the United States spends more in absolute and proportional terms than do other NATO members, but here the United States is the outlier. It spends a great deal more on national defense than other NATO members do, and more than non-NATO members, and pretty much every other country on the face of the planet. But that has nothing to do with NATO. That has to do with political decisions made in Congress and by presidents going back, or of both parties, going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It may be very well that the United States spends too much on the military. I don't think it does. I don't think it spends nearly enough. But that isn't because some other country spends too little. It's not a zero-sum game, damn it. The myth of the free-riding Europeans diverting domestic tax dollars from national security to welfare programs is not supported by the evidence. They don't have unusually small militaries. We have an unusually large and expensive one, or had an unusually large and expensive one, and that was what has kept human civilization from annihilating itself over the past 3/4 of a century. Plain and simple. Now, even so, military spending is not really what ails the federal fiscal condition. If you bother to actually look at the numbers, there's a radical idea, you'll see some interesting things. Back in the Eisenhower era, in the golden year of 1957, we were spending in real GDP terms about 3 times on the military what we spend today. And despite what your communist friends will try to tell you, our taxes were slightly lower, 17.2% of GDP as opposed to 17.7% today. Balanced budget? In 1957, with that radically higher level of military spending and slightly lower level of taxation, we actually ran a surplus, ladies and gentlemen. You can see where I'm headed now, can't you? So how come we now have slightly higher taxes, much lower military spending, but enormous deficits? The answer, of course, is social welfare spending, largely driven by the major entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, that Trump has sworn off trying to reform. Oh, yeah, he's a conservative. Sure. We aren't going to reduce our entitlement-driven deficit by getting the Italians to build a few extra ships. Now, that's a problem in the, well, it's not all that long a term, but Trump's NATO buffoonery is a problem right now. Since 1949, there has never been any serious doubt that the United States would fulfill its obligations to the North Atlantic Alliance. 67 years, folks. That is a big part of why we had a Cold War instead of an all-out nuclear World War III in the 50s and 60s. It is a big part of the reason there is no longer a wall running through Berlin, and why the people who hold Bernie Sanders' political philosophy were able to murder only 100 million innocent human beings instead of 200 million, or 2 billion, as it were. Thanks to Trump, though, the heads of government and defense ministers of the other NATO powers must now reconsider that the United States will welsh on its obligations the way Donald Trump welshes on his debts. He isn't the president yet, of course, and he never will be. But the chance is not entirely zero. It's like the lottery, you know. Oh, the chances of winning 1 in 1.5 billion. Okay, well, if that's statistically it's 0, but if you don't play, then it's 0 in 1.5 billion. That's fully 0. So I mean, we're talking statistically impossible. Not totally impossible, but statistically impossible. But if you are, say, Lithuania, and you suspect that the United States will not actually have your back, a suspicion fortified by Trump's man crush on Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, what do? Maybe you try to get ahead of the curve and go voluntarily into the Russian orbit. Maybe you notice that nobody seriously messes with the psychotic state of North Korea and do what you can to get your hands on a few nuclear weapons. I thought nuclear proliferation was a bad thing. Not to Trump. Just listen to him. They don't know what we are going to do. In other words, it's our enemies who are supposed to be deterred, not our friends. As a consequence, we don't know what they are going to do. And that's how Trump makes the world a more dangerous place, a more unstable place. He's destabilizing human civilization. Even before he were to somehow be elected. Over the next few months, you'll hear some extremists whose main interest is national security making the case that Hillary Ronin Clinton is awful, but much less of a loose cannon and a good deal less Dr. Strange-lovey than is Donald Trump. And he isn't doing anything to prove them wrong. And you know what else? He ain't gonna.